A silent war is unfolding behind boardroom doors and closed borders. No fighter jets, no missiles, just paperwork, trade rules, and a chain of decisions that could freeze factories across the world. The United States is tightening its grip on China's economy. China is pushing back with full force, and the Netherlands, a small country with massive power and global technology, is trapped in the middle of this high-stakes battle. This is not just about politics. This is about the tiny chips inside your car, your phone, your laptop, and even the machines that make modern life possible. A few weeks of disruption in this industry can shut down car plants in Europe, slow production lines in America, and hit consumers with higher prices worldwide. Most people do not realize that one Dutch company sits right at the center of this storm, and it is now pulling entire governments into a dangerous global showdown. Behind the headlines, quiet pressure is happening. The United States is demanding stronger economic resistance against Chinese influence. China is calling it interference. And the Netherlands is forced to choose between its biggest trading partner and its strongest security ally. Deals are being made behind closed doors. International laws are being stretched. Old emergency powers are suddenly being used again. Something that has not happened in decades. But there is more to this story than official statements and press releases. There are details most media outlets skip, like why a chip company that makes old basic technology suddenly became one of the most important assets in global power politics. Or why China is not just angry but strategically calculated in its response, or why European leaders are now quietly nervous about the next move in this escalating conflict. This situation is not only reshaping the tech industry, it is starting to change how countries see economic power itself. Control over supply chains is becoming more important than control over oil. Semiconductor factories are becoming more powerful than army bases, and small countries like the Netherlands are realizing they hold keys that even superpowers cannot ignore. In this video, you will learn how this conflict started and why a single chip company became a global flashpoint. You will understand how the United States is using economic pressure instead of military force. You will see how China is responding in ways that could shake the global auto and electronics industries. And you will discover why the Netherlands is now one of the most important players in a conflict it never wanted to be part of. More importantly, you will learn how this impacts you, your job market, your technology, your cost of living, and the future stability of the global economy. Stay until the end, because we will also break down the possible outcomes of this standoff. Will the US manage to force China into compliance? Will China retaliate in a way that hits Western industries harder than expected? Or will the Netherlands trigger a new economic balance that changes the future of global trade? This is not just another trade dispute. This is a fight over control of the digital world, and it is happening right now while most of the world is not paying attention. Welcome to our channel where we break down the biggest global stories without noise and without distractions. If you want to stay ahead of economic power shifts, technology wars, and global politics, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Nvidia is a Dutch semiconductor company based in the city of Ninjot. It does not make the advanced chips that power artificial intelligence or supercomputers. Instead, it focuses on something less glamorous but just as important: basic or legacy semiconductors. These are the small components found in everyday products like cars, power supplies, home appliances, medical equipment, and industrial machines. Without them, modern manufacturing would simply stall. Even though Nexperia is located in the Netherlands, it is owned by Wing Technology, a large Chinese electronics company. Wing acquired Nexperia in 2019, a deal that barely made headlines at the time. Back then, legacy chips were not seen as strategic assets. They were considered low-risk, low-attention products. That has completely changed in recent years as global supply chains became more fragile and governments realized how much control these small components really give. Most car factories rely heavily on Next various chips. Its products are used for power management, signal processing, and basic control systems. These chips do not grab media attention, but without them, modern vehicles cannot even start. During the global chip shortage, companies like Nexperia became critical players even though they were previously ignored compared to bigger tech giants. This is where US-China tensions enter the picture. The United States has been tightening its grip on technology exports to China. It introduced strong export controls aimed at limiting Chinese access to advanced semiconductor tools and components. These measures were designed to slow China's progress in strategic industries like artificial intelligence, military technology, and high-end computing. As part of this strategy, the United States added Wing Tech, Nexeria's parent company, to a restricted trade list. American officials raised concerns about data security, technology transfer, and the risk of sensitive European chip production being influenced by Chinese state-linked businesses. This move did not directly ban Nexperia, but it placed a shadow over the company and increased pressure on its operations and partnerships in the West. Now, a company that once worked quietly in the background of the global economy has found itself at the center of a major geopolitical struggle. Governments no longer see Nexperia as just a manufacturer. They see it as a strategic asset in a growing technology and economic war. On September 30th, the Dutch government took an extraordinary step that shocked both investors and foreign governments. It activated an old emergency law known as the Goods Availability Act, and moved to take direct control over parts of Nexperia's operations in the Netherlands. This law had originally been designed for wartime or national crisis situations, not for corporate disputes. Its sudden use signaled how seriously the Dutch authorities were treating the issue. The official reasoning centered on fears of sensitive technology leaving Europe and concerns over how the company was being governed under foreign ownership. Dutch officials argued that allowing a strategic semiconductor producer to remain fully influenced by a Chinese parent company created long-term risks. They were worried about intellectual property, supply chain security, and the possibility that critical knowledge could eventually strengthen a foreign competitor outside European control. Behind the formal statements, there was also growing pressure from allies who saw Nexperia not just as a business, but as part of a larger technology battlefield. The situation escalated further when a Dutch court intervened and suspended Nexperia's Chinese chief executive officer. The court cited serious governance concerns, including issues related to decision-making transparency and the level of influence coming from the parent company. This move added a legal dimension to an already tense political conflict. It also sent a clear message that the Netherlands was willing to challenge foreign control, even at the executive level, if national interests were perceived to be at risk. Beijing did not take these actions lightly. Chinese authorities publicly criticized the move and described it as unfair interference in normal business operations. The reaction was not only diplomatic. China responded with concrete economic pressure by imposing new export restrictions on certain Xeria chips that were manufactured inside China. These restrictions tightened the flow of components to international markets and introduced new uncertainty for companies that relied on them, especially in the automotive sector. Behind the scenes, Chinese officials began signaling that this case could become a test for how Western countries treat Chinese-owned companies in the future. What started as a governance intervention in a European semiconductor firm was quickly turning into a symbol of resistance and retaliation in a much larger global power struggle. For months, American officials had been openly warning about the dangers of allowing Chinese companies to hold influence over critical semiconductor infrastructure in Western countries. Their argument was not only about competition, but about security. Chips are no longer seen as simple commercial products. They are treated as strategic tools that power defense systems, communication networks, energy grids, and entire industrial ecosystems. In this environment, control over a chip manufacturer is seen as control over a nation's digital backbone. As the Dutch government moved against Nexperia, many observers began to notice a familiar pattern. Although Dutch officials insisted the decision was made independently, there was a growing perception that Washington stood firmly behind it, behind closed doors. American diplomats had been holding discussions with European leaders about reducing exposure to Chinese-owned technology firms. The message was subtle but clear. Allowing Chinese-controlled companies to dominate sensitive industries carried long-term risks that could not be reversed easily. This pressure did not come only through formal statements. It was expressed through trade policies, security briefings, and strategic alignment talks across the Atlantic. The United States framed the situation as a necessary defense of a shared economic and technological system. It positioned itself as a protector of supply chain security, while suggesting that countries who failed to take action could face future vulnerabilities and even economic consequences. At the same time, Washington expanded its broader economic security framework. This included demands that China adapt to a new international order, where access to advanced technology would be conditional and limited. Export controls, blacklists, and licensing restrictions became tools of leverage rather than simple trade instruments. From Beijing's perspective, this was not negotiation. It was economic coercion dressed as policy. Yet within the tension, there were also quiet signals of temporary easing. As part of a fragile understanding between the two powers, China reportedly began approving more chip export applications than before. These approvals did not mean a full reversal of its stance, but they suggested that Beijing was carefully managing the pressure, calibrating its response rather than escalating in an uncontrolled way. The result was an uneasy balance. Publicly, both sides maintained firm positions. Privately, they operated within narrow channels of compromise, trying to avoid total disruption while still testing each other's limits in this new era of economic confrontation. China's response moved quickly from words to action. Export approvals for certain Xperia chips produced inside China were suddenly tightened and, in some cases, halted. These were not advanced processors, but the basic components used in vehicle control systems, braking modules, power steering, and battery management units. Even a small disruption in the supply of these chips created ripple effects across global car manufacturing. Automakers and parts suppliers began quietly adjusting production schedules as uncertainty grew around delivery timelines and availability. This move was not only economic, it was also a signal by targeting a company tied to both Europe and China. Beijing demonstrated it had leverage over global supply chains and was willing to use it. The message was clear. If access to Chinese-controlled production is threatened, the impact will not stay local. It will spread into Western industries and daily life. At the same time, China launched a strong diplomatic pushback. Officials accused the Netherlands of interfering in legitimate business operations and abandoning the principles of free markets. It had long defended Chinese media framed the move as political discrimination rather than a security decision. They argued that if European countries could remove foreign owners simply because of their nationality, it would weaken global investor trust. Beijing also demanded that the Netherlands reverse what it called unilateral measures. In Chinese official statements, the seizure of control over an Xperia was described as an overreach that damaged international business stability. They warned that such actions could set a dangerous precedent for other Chinese investments in Europe, not only in technology, but in energy, logistics, and manufacturing. Behind the public criticism, diplomacy started moving quietly. Dutch officials traveled to China for closed-door discussions, aiming to calm tensions and find a way out that would not escalate further. These were not symbolic visits. They involved detailed talks about trade access, governance conditions, and the future structure of Nexia's operations. The goal was to avoid long-term damage to economic relations while protecting Dutch strategic interests. China acknowledged the Netherlands' partial suspension of its takeover order as a small step in the right direction, but made it clear that was not enough. It wanted a full rollback and guarantees that similar actions would not happen again. The talks revealed how deeply this issue had moved beyond a single company and into the larger question of how far nations can go in controlling foreign-owned assets during times of global tension. The shockwaves from the chip restrictions did not stay within political circles. They moved straight into production floors and supply networks across the world. Major automotive suppliers began reporting delays, rising costs, and logistical complications. Even companies that had diversified their sources felt the pressure because these components are deeply embedded in modern vehicle systems. Unlike luxury features, these chips cannot be easily replaced or redesigned without long testing cycles and safety approvals. A short disruption quickly turns into months of production imbalance. If this instability continues, the risk of a wider industrial slowdown becomes real. Car makers may be forced to cut output, delay new model launches, or temporarily shut down assembly lines. This does not only affect large manufacturers, It impacts smaller parts suppliers, logistics companies, dealerships, and eventually consumers who face longer waiting times and higher prices. A problem that starts in one European chip factory and a few Chinese export controls can quietly expand into a global economic slowdown within connected industries. Beyond manufacturing, this situation highlights a strategic shift in Europe's thinking. For years, European governments maintained a careful balance in dealing with China, separating commerce from politics. That line is now fading. There is growing caution over how much influence China holds in critical technologies like semiconductors, telecommunications, and energy infrastructure. Nextia has become a case study in how European nations are reassessing that exposure and pushing for stronger technological sovereignty. At the same time, this episode shows how far the United States is willing to go in shaping the decisions of its allies. It is no longer just about American companies competing with Chinese firms. It is about building a coordinated front to limit Chinese control over sensitive sectors. This approach is not subtle. It influences laws, investments, and national security policies far beyond U.S. borders. The use of the Goods Availability Act adds another layer of meaning. This law dates back to Cold War conditions when governments prepared for national emergencies and wartime shortages. Its revival in a corporate takeover dispute signals something deeper. It suggests that supply chain control is now treated on the same level as military readiness. Governments are preparing for economic conflicts the way they once prepared for armed ones. It also sets a powerful example. Other countries are now watching closely. If the Netherlands can activate emergency powers to intervene in a private semiconductor company, others might follow. This could reshape how foreign investments are handled in strategic sectors, not just in Europe but across the world. It is a sign that globalization is slowly giving way to controlled, security-driven economics. After weeks of rising tension and economic pressure, the Netherlands made a move toward de-escalation by suspending its takeover order on next period. This decision was presented as a step to stabilize the situation and create space for dialogue. It did not mean a full reversal, but it signaled that the HEG understood the wider consequences of allowing the dispute to spin further out of control for global markets and European industry leaders. Even a temporary pause brought a small sense of relief. China publicly welcomed the decision, but its tone made it clear that this was not the end of the matter. Chinese officials described the suspension as a starting point, not a solution. They continued to push for a complete rollback of the intervention and long-term guarantees against similar actions in the future. In their view, anything short of that still leaves Chinese investments in Europe exposed to political risk. At the same time, a new layer of concern began to surface around product quality. Enperia warned that certain chips manufactured in China after a specific point in time might not meet the same quality standards expected by its customers. This was not a diplomatic statement. It was a technical and operational warning aimed at manufacturers who depend on stable, consistent components for safety-critical systems like vehicles and industrial control units. Even a small variation in quality can lead to large-scale recalls, legal liability, and long-term damage to trust. Behind the scenes, talks continued. Officials and trade representatives worked through technical details, legal frameworks, and potential compromises. There were discussions about governance structures, production standards, and possible safeguards to protect both national security and commercial stability. Some observers saw this as an opportunity to design a new model for managing foreign ownership in sensitive industries. Yet, despite these efforts, the underlying risks did not vanish. Semiconductor supply chains remain fragile and highly concentrated. A few factories, a few shipping routes, and a handful of strategic decisions can still disrupt global production. Countries continue to view technology as leverage, not just commerce. As long as chips are treated as tools of power, every agreement remains temporary, and every calm moment carries the possibility of another sharp turn. So, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The United States applied pressure. The Netherlands moved to block a sensitive takeover. China responded with strong warnings and countermoves. And what we're seeing now isn't just political drama. It is a chain reaction across chips, trade, technology, and power. Every decision made in Washington, Beijing, or The Hague is sending ripples through the global tech system. From chip factories to consumer products, from supply chains to national security strategies, nothing is isolated anymore. So here sits the real question. What does all this mean for the future of global tech supply chains? Are we heading toward cooperation or a permanent split in the world's technology systems? Because one thing is clear, these trade and tech battles don't just affect governments. They affect companies, jobs, prices, and even the devices we use every day. This is why it's important to stay informed on these geopolitical shifts. They are not far away. They shape the world around you. If you found this breakdown useful, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into global power, technology, and the real stories behind the headlines. And tell us in the comments, where do you think this global tech war is heading?